Let's try that now. Do we have sound? Do we have sound now? Oh, it's a good thing we found out now. Thank you, B. Technical difficulties. Yay, stream. Alright, so as I was saying, for the part that probably won't be closed captioned when it hits up the replay, but yeah, basically we're going to be talking about something I haven't done in quite a while, and actually it was the thing that got me into sort of game design and tinkering with games in the first place. And that is modular maps and basically game board illustration. It's kind of an interesting crossover because I think in a lot of ways it's kind of how I got into designing games, at least as an adult, because it was something I was really interested in, and it just it was this hobby that just sort of developed into this skill set, which, from what I can tell, is not particularly common. There are only a handful of people that sort of specialize in this sort of illustration. So I think it's a little bit unusual, and maybe I have a unique take on it. I guess we'll find out as I dive into this. But yeah, welcome to the stream. So today's stream is actually a suggestion of one of our YouTube commenters, Lanier. So thank you very much for that. I decided to take you up on it. And I know a lot of the times I'll show you kind of finished stuff. Like, for example, I've got map tiles from Lynn Vander's Terminator Genesis board game. This one's actually from the expansion. This is from the Fall of Skynet expansion, this map tile. But today I've also actually got some old process stuff. And I think maybe I've shown you guys these before, but this is several of them. There's a whole drawer full of these. But these are notebooks that I would have done early sort of process design and thinking about some of these projects within. So, for example, just bookmarked a couple of pages here to show you. That's quite a bit older, but there you go. You guys can see. Oh, there we go. Now it's right side up. But early tile design for certain games and sort of how the modularity might work or how they might fit together. And my notebooks are full of this stuff. I actually use sticker inserts so that I can draw on hex grids sometimes, because the notebooks, nobody prints a hex gridded notebook. At least not that I have seen. And I kind of like the square gridded one, so that's a whole other thing. But yeah, thanks all for joining me today. I guess sort of the first place to start is kind of how you guys end up seeing the end result of this, and then maybe I'll kind of walk back through sort of how we got there. So I've got the Terminator Genesis Rise of the Resistance missions book, which is all of the scenarios that you can play over the course of a campaign, because it is a campaign-based game. But each of the scenarios has a map, right? And the whole reason that you would do modular tiles in the first place is to be able to make more maps than you would otherwise have content for, right? Because in a lot of our games, and in a lot of board games, period, you really only need one play area because you have other parts of the game that change out or are responsible for the variety, right? And I think I've shown you guys this one before. This is the Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the board game board, and it is so big that I can't unfold it completely. But this one's been out for quite a while. So, I think I've talked about this one on stream before, and I do remember showing you some other stuff in this style. So this is one of the ways that I've kind of learned to illustrate, where we've got a lot of detail in sort of cityscapes and game boards. The Evil Dead 2 one as well was a fairly big illustration project that I did. But it's kind of interesting, at least to me, or it's a very different experience working on working on a game that has a static board from working on a game that has a tile set. The end art result is kind of the same in some ways, but in other ways, they're radically different. Designing a tile set is much more a systems design exercise and making sure that they will fit together in the way that you want, rather than just here's the illustration, here's the grid on it, this is the play area for the whole game. Designing a tile set the modularity provides some interesting challenges as well as some interesting opportunities. I'm going to show you guys one more example of a map that I did, actually, because I think it's important for this context. So this is an oldie. This is a Mighty Maps Office High Rise 2011. This is illustrated by me back when a friend of mine and I were running a map illustration business called Armored Cartographers. This is actually probably close to the beginning of my professional game illustration career, because we used to print and sell these online, and we would sell them through a number of gaming stores, including our own. Now I'm going to back up a bit so you can see it a little better, because this is a huge poster print. There you go. I'm going to be real quiet there for a sec, because I'm behind the poster, but it's a huge illustration in print resolution, right? So even just the specs on your machine or whatever you're going to use to assemble all of this, and scroll it and scroll it and scroll it, being able to work in this size, even you need some actual power on your computer. But the number one thing and the reason I'm showing you this one in particular as such a huge fold-out paper map is that, yes, this is one design that has sort of the tiles and everything kind of worked out, but also it's actually made out of a bunch of smaller pieces. Like, it is almost a tile-based design, it's just that the tiles are hidden from you in the end. Now, if you look at sort of this very top corner, you can see that there's tables and chairs and cutlery on them. There are a refrigerator and some potted plants, and then there are kind of all of these other existing pieces. If something like Terminator Genesis is a map tile that is, modular, that you can tessellate in different directions, all of the same pieces that I would sort of develop and use to make those illustrations are actually basically the same working library. The initial part of the process is very similar to a map like this, because all of these assets are functionally going to be used and arranged as I need to make all the various rooms and what have you. In the case of something like this, the only difference is that I've got things that are not necessarily on one static grid, where I don't have like a default tile size where they all tessellate together, but also it's a little bit different in terms of just like having a little more freedom with the art, because you don't have to necessarily make sure things map perfectly to tile edges. Whereas part of doing modular tiles is you have to actually make sure that they tessellate or that they line up properly. Richard Durr says there was a Kickstarter for an FTF for dungeon drawing in that system map style. Interesting. I'll have to look that up. Maybe send me the link later. I love that sort of thing. I see we have a lot of our regulars on stream as well. We've got, hi B, good to see you. I see you're back. And Jared and Ryan, I guess. Ryan's asking, is anyone else thinking of Die Hard, making a Die Hard game using this office map? It's a little more modern than that, although it does have the old school PC towers with very, very big CRT monitors. This is set in a comic book era before flat screen computer screens, which made it kind of fun to illustrate. But the whole idea about like having an art library for this sort of thing, a lot of projects in whatever line it is. So, for example, I think I did about 3 or 4 of these Mighty Map illustrations, and my business partner at the time, Matt, I think went on to do probably a dozen or so. But one of the things that we collectively made and used to do all of these maps was actually a shared object library. So I think I ended up at one point sitting down and drawing from that top-down view 4 or 5 different kinds of chairs, a couple of different office chairs and a couple of different like regular chairs with legs, a few different couches, some leather chairs, and just sort of built like every category of thing that we might want to use on a map. There is a file that I've got that has all of those objects that is literally a drag and drop palette. If you've ever played The Sims or any game like that where you're building and you've got sort of like a toolbox window of like bits and pieces you can drag and position, approaching a project like this from an art perspective is actually a lot like that. There's a very strong like need to kind of have everything standardized. I mean, I know there are people that illustrate tiles for games or map illustrations for games that don't necessarily use an object library like this. They might hand paint everything. And the more I do this, the more comfortable, I guess, I am with doing that. In fact, most of Evil Dead 2's game board was actually not object library stuff. It was hand painted because I only had one chair. I only had a particular rocking chair and I wanted to make it look like the film. So rather than drawing an object that I was going to intend to reuse across different rooms or in different combinations, it just ended up not really being... It didn't make sense to put all that effort into designing a generic object that was really reusable when all I had to do was paint one in the corner of the room at a particular angle. So in that sense, it was like, not every project benefits from doing this, but as soon as you get into like tiles, where there's anything that you're going to start repeating, tile in, tile out, then it gets kind of difficult to maintain that style. And the thing that I realized with Terminator is like probably the first big project we did where getting the tiles to line up in a certain way so that no matter how we arrange them to make the scenarios, they would look good, or they would look... Maybe good is a stretch in the sense that like two tiles, not every tile perfectly matches with other tiles, but good in like they're the same color palette, the same lighting, the same environment. They look like they belong in the same game and don't create a really awkward transition when you see them adjacent to one another. So in Terminator, we have a few different kinds of tiles, and they're largely double-sided front and back. There's a whole set of, well, let's call them, I don't know, biomes is what you would call them if they were made out of plants and stuff, but tile sets, basically. So there's like an interior sort of generic sci-fi military-based set, which kind of looks like this. It has, metal walls and piping and, some borderline sci-fi detailing, and then, these kind of grids in the floor. This is actually a Fall of Skynet one, which is why it's a little more sci-fi. But the other ones... Did I grab all Fall of Skynet ones? I did. Let me grab one more, because I don't have a good example of the standard game. There it is. There's the more modern human military base. The one I was showing you is the Fall of Skynet. Kind of more sci-fi look to it. And, I have a lot of experience doing kind of everything from sci-fi through fantasy, so textures and stuff on these would have been probably object library sort of things. I have my favorite metal textures and stone textures and all of that, and that gets reused. But the game had a whole bunch of different kinds of tile sets. There's this one, there's the sci-fi one. There is a kind of apocalypse outdoor wasteland tile set, which is really just an asphalt texture with some dirt and some grass and some detailing on it. And then there's a few that are kind of funky. So like there's an outdoor one that has a crater in it, and that was painted specifically for that tile. But then there's a few indoor ones that are actually a sewer. And part of getting all of these sort of designed and planned out was actually also really tied to what story we wanted to tell with the game. As much as like this is an illustration job to make this component, there's a lot of game design that goes into it as well, because they kind of have to work together, and you have to sort of be able to massage all of these pieces. I'm actually going to show you, I found, in looking through my old files, I found something you might be interested to see. This is, just make sure I can actually use my tablet here because I'm drowning in tiles. But this is actually a really old, early working document for the tiles I just showed you. I'm not even sure this is drawn to scale. How big is that? Oh, okay, yeah, these are drawn 1:1. So, in my Illustrator file. But this was a particularly interesting game because we wanted square tiles with hexagons on them. And kind of mapping... Hexagons are great for any game that's like strictly outdoor. The shape and the sort of contours of what happens when you have groups of hexes together have a weirdly naturalistic look to them. Like if you try and illustrate a cliff face to fit to a hex grid, it looks great. If you illustrate a cliff face to a square grid, it looks great. But when you get into human-made structures like buildings and rooms and interiors and, you know, houses and that sort of thing, roads, unless you're in the vertical axis, like this direction, on the hex grid, things get a little screwy, and you kind of have to make some interesting concessions. You can see here there's some early tinkering with how the hex grid's going to map to the various rooms. And one of the sort of fun weirdnesses I discovered when making the tile set for this game was actually I didn't want the hex grid to go to the edge of the tiles. I ended up making kind of a hex worth of, or a half hex worth of dead space around all of the edges so that we could fit wall graphics in, so that they weren't just, right, so we have this kind of border with the walls on them, and so that they weren't just black lines or gray lines where the walls should be. They're not truly straight top down, as if you would just cut the building in half. Like every room has its own slight perspective effect, but they're not really in perspective because the X and Y walls on these tiles, because they're a hex grid and the hexes are, you know, perfectly symmetrical, the tiles aren't square, they're rectangles. And this introduced a whole pile of complexity for us because I needed different shaped tiles for hallways depending on whether I was going to lay them out horizontally or vertically. And that in turn affected where I could put doors on other tiles for how they might line up, and also affected how I could lay out my games. The scenario for any given, the map layout for any given scenario became kind of difficult when we were a little bit constrained about the available tiles. It's weird, like you think about a tile set as being something that you can make like an infinite number of permutations for, but in fact we only had, I think there's like 12 tiles in Terminator Genisys. There's 5 big ones and they're double-sided, and then there's a couple of each of the smaller sizes. I think there's 4 small ones. Because the big ones tend to be the sort of centerpiece of any given scenario. But I was using this file to kind of figure out how I might fit them together and start to make sure that I wasn't double using a tile. Because if you buy the game and you get one copy of the punchboard set in the box, you're not going to be able to take a tile and use the front and back of it because you only have one. And I actually made this mistake in laying out one of the maps for Terminator Genisys very early on, because I was playing around in an InDesign file where I was just duplicating things. And then I realized later, like, oh, I can't have 2 of that L-shaped corner room because they're both tile S2. And that's a little bit weird. B says you're observing the same weirdness of hex fields in a human surrounding in my game. Yeah, rooms don't like being in squares or in hexes. They don't really map properly, and you get some kind of interesting conceits. We basically got around it in Terminator by lining up the hex grid so that an intersection for both corners was on the corner of a tile, right? Like, you've got this sort of half hex here, where there's a half hex on this side and a half hex on this side, and then you can easily tile them. And then the actual size of these punchboard tiles was literally determined by the size of the box the game came in. The punchboards were, just under 12 inches square, and the vertical length of the tile had to fit on that punchboard. And once it did, we ended up with something that was well, you know if you own the game or punched it, but the tile that the punchboard sheets that they come on are like this shape. The tile takes up most of the punchboard sheet, and then there's a little strip of tokens to punch out on the side, just to, economize and actually save that cardboard, not just waste it. And not to waste effort having the ball pre-punched or sorted in the factory. But if you've played Terminator Genesis, this is actually some of the really early tile layout thinking for how these scenarios might go together. And I think we designed this tile set for this map here. Looks pretty close to the first scenario. This is probably early thinking for that. This certainly was. But a lot of the actual tiles and what was on them ended up being created for specific scenarios. Like, the features on certain tiles are the result of the scenarios that we were making them for. We didn't... Kind of in the same way that, like, if you're illustrating a static game board, you want to make sure it has every feature. Well, we kind of were like, well, hey, we need this tile set for this mission. A generic hallway, or a set of generic hallways and rooms that we'll put some small art details on, and then make each tile a slightly different color or a slightly different, like, terrain feature on them, so that you can identify which one is which on the map. Particularly if they're like L-shaped hallways or corners or whatever. It gets a little bit tricky when you're trying to tell someone how to lay out a map on a diagram, like in that Terminator mission book, where, setting up that diagram is going to be a huge pain if A, I don't tell you, and there's a little spoiler for further on in the campaign if you haven't played it, but, I actually tell you exactly which tiles you need, so you can pull them out, and then they look different enough with their various, like, this one has a floodlight on it, and the two various corner rooms, like, one has a spotlight on it on this side. This guy down here. There's a spotlight on the tile, so you can kind of tell it apart, even if it's the same kind of art look and feel as the other tiles of the same size. Keeping them distinct is really important, and that's part of the art challenge for the game, too, right? Like, yes, you want them all to play well together, but you also want them to look distinct and essentially sort of be worth it. Unless you are using them in so many ways that making them individual doesn't make sense. Gascony's Legacy is a great example of a game that we did where the tiles are not they're basically generic designs on the floors, and it was done entirely because there was no terrain on them. We built all of the terrain bespoke for our scenarios because it suited the design of the game better, rather than lavishly illustrating a bunch of different rooms or a bunch of cobbled city streets. It just didn't make sense. The curious thing about Terminator, and you can see it in this example here, I don't remember if we actually did this in the game, in the finished mission. I suppose I could look, actually, because this is the mission map for 4. I could look it up. No, we didn't. So early on I realized, you could see it in this one, actually. It's the same tile there at the end of the gate. This one is aligned to the grid, but they don't necessarily have to be. And kind of how this came about was realizing that there's a certain atomic unit, smallest non-divisible unit of tile in a system like this that you're going to make. Everything else is a multiple of that size, either horizontally or vertically or both. And as long as you keep all of your designs and all of your doorways and stuff to those dimensions, then everything will continue to work. At least the geometry of it will. They'll all line up, and that will all kind of work out for you. And that's true whether they're squares or hexagons or whatever. As long as you have some kind of minimum unit that you can base all of the tiles around. So here, the original plan for this tile was going to be not to put a tile down here, but just to butt it up against the middle of the other tile. And that was fine in an early prototype, but then as soon as we started wanting to use these tiles in other scenarios, it didn't work that well anymore, because any other scenario where you wanted to use this tile for its road portion, it wouldn't play nice with friends. It just, you had this situation where the road just spontaneously dead ends. And in Terminator, the actual solution to this, it all looks great if you've got adjacent tiles that have the same patterning, right? So like these ones, sure, there's this kind of blue-edged, metal-edged border that they do. And it all works great as soon as you are doing, if you've got one complete biome or whatever have you. But as soon as you start doing things where you want to mix and match, or you want to transition from one tile to another, even if the geometry works, like this one, for example, like those line up, it's a little jarring. The fact that there's a kind of this metal airlock or sort of footstep basically between the two tiles means that it's a little bit less jarring to do that. And then obviously if you've got different kinds of interiors, those still help join them together because you end up with something like that. And you can see even here, very quickly, even within about 3 millimeters of the actual join between the two tiles, the darker one here has a completely different atmosphere and very quickly becomes dark. So yeah, at least, they go together, they look like they join, but only by virtue of kind of smashing them together. It's not like they have a perfectly continuous floor plan. And that turned out to be the best way to kind of smooth over the art and hide some of those unsightly gaps between them. It was actually a really kind of weird challenge, particularly because I had doorways of different widths. So I had doorway tiles, but I had to design them in such a way that they looked right in the room, whether they were arranged horizontally or whether they were arranged vertically. And in the end, we basically didn't end up having any doors in a map that went along the short edge of the board. Like this space here in this little diagram that is like the hex and a half for the top end door, there is no door tile in the game that fits over that spot, which meant if we wanted doors or we wanted to do anything in the scenarios using the doors, they all had to be against the long edge of the tile, which totally changed how we were able to lay out some of our missions. Because it was like, they're going to go here and they're going to bust open this door and do all of that stuff. The alternative would have been to have, this is the one that ended up existing, the sort of 2 hexes with the barrier across. But in order to make the other one work, I would have had to make a second door tile, which is just like horrendous. And rather than trying to make a totally complete system and figure out exactly how that was going to happen, we just ended up deciding to basically design around the problem, just completely ignore it and set it aside. It turned out not to be a thing at all, which was kind of a weirdness of that design. And sort of once we got a lot of this stuff planned out, and you can see I've even got my identifier numbers on them, the kind of resulting following step was, once you've built all your scenarios, you go and you iterate the position of all of the doors, all of the cover on those tiles, all their terrain features, and then collate them front and back so that you actually know what your toolkit is. What is the final set of tiles that you can build your scenarios with? Because if you don't figure this out, you make the mistake that I did where you end up placing a duplicate tile that doesn't actually exist in the box and becomes a huge problem. I mean, obviously, if they're generic or if they all have sort of doors on 4 sides, you don't care. But for a game like this, where every tile has specific terrain, specific zones, and generally is thematic in such a way to reflect the scenario that it's for, you kind of can't do that. So here even, I'm not even sure this is the Skynet gate tile from the core game. I am actually not sure it has this grid in the final design. I can't remember. I think it doesn't. I think that tile probably got changed further along. This one I'm also not sure exists in its current state shown here. They're close. A lot of them are close. This one down here I know for sure exists. And like this one I think was the original tile I designed with the occupied hexes in the middle. And I think this one got rethemed and rotated probably. I don't think it's in this arrangement in the final game. So, I mean, even at this stage, like, you can tinker with them a bit, right? And then otherwise, you just kind of have to make sure, like, with all of the big ones designed that were going to be kind of the centerpieces for each mission that would be reused less, a lot of the smaller ones were just really pragmatic. It was like, okay, well, in order to join the couple of big tiles together that we need to make this mission layout, we actually just need a T intersection with the doors like that. We need a left turning room like this, a right turning room like that, a single hallway, and then all the outdoor ones ended up just being blank, like no walls, don't have to worry about how they line up, but just having enough of them to be able to fill in spaces on the mission design for when you had scenarios that used them. So it was a really kind of strange process of working through all of that modularity and making sure that the tiles that we had was going to not raise any eyebrows when we design a map and, you know, the story describes this room as an armory. And you kind of look at it and go, well, is that an armory? There's a little bit of sort of suspension of disbelief that happens in Terminator with regards to its fiction, and I think that's true with, frankly, a lot of games. But it is absolutely a challenge of like trying to strike a balance between, if you're going to do tiles, you're doing them because you want to reuse them. And if you want to reuse them, they can't really be super unique unless you have a lot of scenarios that take place in a space that you're telling the player is identical. And then it's kind of up to your fiction to sell the art style and all of that. So that was kind of, that was a very sort of strange challenge in some ways to get all of that stuff squared away for Terminator. But it was cool. I think it was certainly I would do a game with this sort of tile set again. There were a lot of kind of cool things we were able to do with it. And if you've never played the Fall of Skynet expansion for it, there's this little bonus tile, which is actually not in what I would call in system. It's in the grid, but it's narrower. It doesn't fit. It's not the other tiles are not a multiple of it. And this is explicitly an elevator. And in Fall of Skynet, there's a scenario where when everybody who's standing on this tile, you get to pick it up and move it to somewhere else in the play area. So it was a case where we deliberately cheated the system because we had something else in mind for the component. Even though that tile is kind of useless because it's A, a dead end, so the best you can do with it is cap a hallway, and B, too small to kind of do anything interesting with. So the fact that it was like an elevator that you could move to simulate traveling between two floors, which were separately set up groups of tiles, turned out to work really well. And incidentally, we didn't really have room on the punch board for a bigger tile than that, so it all kind of came together. It was kind of cool that way. B is saying, if you have different scenarios with only one room, would you prefer to design a separate tile for each scenario, or would you prefer to modify one tile with design tokens? This is an interesting question, because it kind of comes down to how important is it that the base of that scenario look different? How many of these are in the game? Is there a case to be made where they're all the same? Is there a case to be made where there are 4 of them, so you need just 2 double-sided boards? And in fact, actually, that is very close to how a game we're working on currently works. In fact, actually, B, I think it's one you've playtested. It has 2 double-sided punch boards in the box, which are big square tiles, and there's just sort of 4 unique art pieces, but essentially each one brings something different to the game. At the other end, like I was saying before with Gascony's Legacy, you can get into just having a generic tile where you then populate it with a bunch of pieces as you need, and you can have cards or a scenario book or whatever that instructs you, will instruct the player about where to put all of those pieces, so that, yes, even though they're getting the same components out of the box, the arrangement of those rooms makes them feel different by virtue of all the tiles you're putting on them. Now, even in that situation, if you make a generic room, if you have a generic basic tile that's just like got some texture to it or whatever, or is designed to look like a particular room, you're then actually still doing the same kind of tile design, because all of the smaller tiles you're putting on the big tile are going to be probably from some kind of art object library, because you're going to need, like, assume for a second it's a room or a house or whatever. You're going to need, like, the standard types of furniture, and if your game has traps or whatever, you kind of get the thing I'm getting across here, which is just like the individual smaller tiles you're putting on your big tiles actually do a lot of your heavy lifting in terms of art to dress up what that tile looks like, and gameplay effects of how that tile behaves, even though you're not necessarily making one big map out of all of those tiles. That's kind of a thing. So definitely, like, planning for the modularity of it and making sure that the tiles kind of work well together is one thing. Having an art object library where all these things kind of work together, and so that no matter which two tiles you put together, there's not a huge jarring gap between them when you are like, oh, this one's indoors, that one's outdoors, this one is, the sewer tunnels, this one is inside the base. Like, all of those are considerations for how this works. Now, that's one kind of tile set. We've actually done some other kinds as well, and interestingly enough, that's not the hex one. I had a couple of notebooks set aside here. A lot of my actual experience doing maps has been maps with square grids. I haven't done that much with hex stuff. Hexes made sense for Terminator because they were kind of sci-fi and kind of matched the aesthetic of the film. It was actually a good fit for the intellectual property, just aesthetically, and then we kind of based all of the other gameplay concerns around them. But a lot of the maps that I designed, even, from a storytelling perspective, or like what I'm going to try and communicate with the illustration, are thumbnail studies. Like, they're not even... Most of my map design for bigger projects looks like this, where I'm just trying to kind of locate very high level where things might actually be on the map or on the play area. Now, I can't read these offhand. Can I? I think this sketch is titled Volcano Base. So I guess this is like the island from The Incredibles? Who knows? Or at least this page is. I don't know what this other page is. These are pretty old sketches. When is this notebook from? This is a 2011 notebook, so 9 years. 9 years ago. Sketches for maps that were never made. There's an interesting freelance one actually I did. This was a fantasy map. I have to see if I could find that. It was a hex-based fantasy map, and at the time I'd never done anything on a hex grid. So I kind of had to teach myself how it was all going to line up and fit together. But I also have some experience. Let's see if I can find an example of it. I know I've got it in the closet back there. I have an 8-foot long single vinyl pull-out map of a Star Wars cityscape that I would have made myself for an event that I ran at Gen Con in 2011? 2012? Long before I joined Linvander. I had this same project. It was armored cartographer stuff and has since been printed on paper. But at the time, it was made specifically for this Gen Con mega format battle where we took way too many Star Wars miniatures, a group of 12 players in 2 teams of 6, and put them at opposite sides along this. I mean, if you've ever been to or seen Gen Con, they kind of arrange the tables in these really long columns. But yeah, we grouped all of these players together on opposite sides of the table and just went at it. I'm going to keep talking, but I'm kind of now thinking I should have prepped that image to show you because it's pretty neat. Let's see if we can pull it up. Because I know for sure that it is... I think it's on the internet, actually. I think you can see it. Let's see. So, it was an interesting... Doing maps that size is also kind of a weird constraint because once you get above a certain kind of size, it's actually better to start treating really large pieces like that, even as if they are big tile sets. You get to the point where like there's no sense in trying to make each part of that map unique when now you have one giant thing that's just way too specific. Rather than doing that, if you make it all kind of play well together, then you get a lot more mileage out of it because then you can mix and match all of those individual parts. I'm going to pop this over to the main window here. You guys can check out my... This is straight from my web browser. This is my... Yeah, there it is. This is stuff that I made for Star Wars miniatures, or just generic 28mm sci-fi gaming. And this is old stuff, 05 to 2012. This is the one I was talking about. But how much bigger can we go? That's big. I don't have a full resolution on the internet because we did sell this. So, yeah, you can actually see if you look closely. You kind of get into this spot where there's a row of these big columns. These are actually 2x2 squares on the illustration. How much bigger can we make this? Ooh, quite a bit bigger. That's pretty good. So this thing scrolls forever. Basically, this chunk here that's on screen now, with the column row along the top and column row along the bottom, is essentially one really big tile. It has... Those columns will always line up, or they will butt up against the side of a building, like is happening at the bottom here. Where you kind of see where this hangar bay has this sort of like row of half columns sticking out the bottom. And there's a cute little spot where there's a quarter column, just to keep it in system. But then even the left and right and top and bottom, like the roadways, the whole map is actually like the shape of an H. So there are roadways on the left and right half that will carry on north-south through all the maps. But then there are also east-west roadways in pairs. And the end result is that you basically get city blocks with boulevards between them. So like here we've got in the top right-hand corner like this little like speeder bike garage, and the road kind of like that little side street almost still fits into the overall pattern because it's inside one tile. But then you kind of have this weird thing where you get multiple tiles or multiple larger maps fitting together, where you either get buildings with columns on the walls or you get boulevards with columns between them. This is actually a pretty fun map to play on. And because I had laid it out along the entire table, the way we're looking at it now, one whole team would have been in all of the buildings on the left-hand side of the block, and the other team would have had all the buildings on the right-hand side, and they would have been moving their clone troopers and battle droids and various other units around the space to kind of capture stuff. And if you want to check this out later, this is actually on my Flickr page. Who uses Flickr anymore? This is long before the days of Instagram being a thing, which is the only reason it exists. Let's see. Anything else interesting about this? I mean, yeah, there's a couple of cool parts where, like, the street grid on each of the 4 maps, because it's essentially 4 pieces you can mix and match. The street grid on each one is different. So, I think, yeah, this one has the big boulevard in the middle. It's got this kind of bunker at one end and then a boulevard in the middle. And all the other ones, the boulevard ends up being at the side. But you get a very kind of different experience if you take these and make them in an L, or you make them in a rectangle the other direction where you've got like 2 and 2. And kind of arranged like that, it changes the feel quite a bit. And if you were playing a role-playing game, like maybe you're doing a street chase where you've got, the players are running through the streets, part of the cool thing about making these functional as tiles where they're basically seamless edge to edge is, you could play one map at a time. You could run through that map, and then as soon as your players hit the far side of the map, you could basically take it and either pull another map off the shelf and put it down, and then have them continue onto that, almost like you were doing a dungeon crawl with very, very large tiles. And you could just keep doing that. Like, they could explore in whatever direction, and you could just pull out the appropriate map and put it down like a giant tile. And the maps have quite a bit on them. Like, they're buildings with rooms in kind of different districts of the city. So there was a lot to do, a lot of possibilities, ways to use that map, beyond just having it on a vinyl roll. I mean, I kept the vinyl roll because I think it was super cool, and at the time I probably paid way too much money for the vinyl print. I remember getting it delivered to the office building where I was working at the time, and wandering into the boardroom, the conference room that has 12 seats at it, when no one else was using it, and unrolling it just to look at it when I first got it, because it's I think it's still pretty impressive. Some other stuff there that is older maps, but I think most of the stuff that I did on larger poster maps like that was not modular. They didn't really have the same concerns. Even if they had square grids, you could butt them together, but they weren't designed for it. Jared says, all I know is that Smug Mug bought Flickr, so it must still be used by some people. There's definitely still a following. I do think Instagram has probably taken quite a bit from it, just by virtue of Facebook integrations and stuff. Flickr has always, even when Yahoo owned it, they were very big on positioning themselves as the platform for professional photographers, or very enthusiastic photographers who are all about their camera specs. I mean, Flickr shows you camera details of what camera was used to take this photo and the lens information and all of that, because if you shoot with a digital camera, that information is encoded in your files. So Flickr had this whole UI to display all of this data, and it was really funny to me because I would sometimes post, like, if you take a digital photo and edit it or cut parts out of it or cut them together, you can end up with something that was not taken by a camera, but that still has all of the camera metadata. And then there's probably an algorithm somewhere in Flickr that was really confused by this. I think otherwise it's like a lot of this map work ended up being the foundation that really got me into the idea of doing art for games. Star Wars Miniatures never had that many maps to play on, and that was actually part of why we did Armored Cartographers in the first place, was to make more maps to play on, to make the game more interesting, add more variety, and to capture some locations that were unlikely to ever be released by Wizards of the Coast, because they weren't kind of well-known enough, popular enough. Let's see if I can find... There was a map that I did, and I have a newfound appreciation for this now. I don't actually think it's on here. That's weird and kind of too bad. I remember in about, I think it was 2004, 2005, Star Wars Miniatures put out a starter set for Revenge of the Sith, because that was the Star Wars film that came out at that time. And I know the person who illustrated the map that came in that box, and I remember the response from the community about this map was really, really not very good. They thought it was not interesting to play on. They thought the artwork on it was not very interesting. It didn't really look like the film, which people were a little bit confused about. But knowing what I know now about how licensed games get pitched and developed, I can pretty confidently say that whoever the artist was that made that map, they were not given any reference material from the movie aside from a rough description of, please make a lava planet with lava icebergs to fight on, basically. And that is essentially what that map looks like. So I totally get that, like, this is probably like this. The map is probably like this because of the constraints of licensors not sharing enough reference material to make everything coherent for what is essentially a film tie-in product that, not all licensors care very much, frankly. Some do. Some are awesome. But some also just, I think, don't know their brands well enough or don't have the bandwidth or interest in that level of oversight of how a game will work, or how somebody that's paying them royalties. There's a limit to how much some of them care about how much effort they're going to put into overseeing and making sure that it's all perfect and fits and matches the vision. It's actually one of the reasons why I like working on older films, or at the very least like TV shows or properties where the story is self-contained, has no planned sequels, and has kind of an existing built-up base about what that world looks like, right? And the stories that you can tell in that world. In some ways, that's way easier to illustrate because anything you want to draw, you have primary sources in the form of the actual thing. It's out, it exists, you can find it, you can watch it, you can go through it frame by frame and pull stills. That was actually one of the awesome parts about working on Evil Dead. It was like, well, what should this corner of this room look like? I don't know. It's probably in the film. I could go find it and take screenshots of it and reference it and then just put that in the corner. Like that was absolutely how I made the game board for Evil Dead. And on one of my previous streams, probably quite a number of streams ago now, I remember I have shown that one off. And now, of course, Evil Dead 2 is available in retail. You can actually get it from Jasco. So you can see that game board. It's got some coverage. People have now seen it. It is published. But a lot of stuff we're working on now doesn't have game boards, really, or doesn't have these kinds of literal tile experiences. That's been kind of an interesting shift for me. Divinity was maybe the first project I ever worked on where, maybe Reanimator actually, but we've done a couple of games where the game system doesn't really lend itself to figurines on a map. It's not literal like that. All of those steps, like where characters are and what they're doing, all of that stuff is just abstract. So you don't have tiles with little itty bitty art of like chairs and tables and, features from inside rooms. You just get all of this kind of stuff. Sort of almost more like film stills or representational scenes of places and not illustrations of their floor plans or how they fit together. In some ways, that choice is also dictated by the license. If we're working on a licensed property, I think if Evil Dead didn't have such a coherent setting, like if the film wasn't just centered around a cabin in the woods, I don't think we would have had an illustration of it. Even if the cabin was like a third of the film, I kind of don't think that we would have done a game board featuring the cabin as the primary focus. And this was actually the topic of some debate when we began design work for what would become our Army of Darkness board game. It was like, how do you take a story that has not dozens and dozens of scenes that look different, but like 3 or 4 big pieces, and how do you map that to the components for a game or the design for a game in a way that makes sense. Probably you're not illustrating game boards or maps like this. So that's, again, something kind of a completely different situation with a completely different set of possible solutions. I mean, I'm not saying there's one totally right or wrong course of action about how to lay out a game like that, but there are all these kinds of interesting choices. So I guess to sum up, for me, it's really about the style of map for a game, and whether or not you need a modular tile set, whether or not that truly helps with replayability or helps you get all of your scenarios and boards laid out in a way that makes the game replayable, or whether you just need a static game board, which is an illustration of one space, or if it's a static game board that's modified by tiles, or if it's just one big, very large paper print, like these Mighty Maps that I was showing earlier. It really depends on the project, and regardless of which style of sort of map or tile you end up with, it's very difficult to separate the artwork from the gameplay and mechanics on something like this, because the art literally is there to immerse you in that space, or to make you kind of give you an overhead view of these characters being in this space and draw you into the game and provide table presence that people are going to come and see and catch their eye and be like, oh, that is a cool looking game because I like the setting of this sort of the visual story that the tiles are telling. So I'm going to wrap it there for this week. Thank you all for tuning in about this chat about modular tiles and maps and illustrations. It was fun to show some of my older work. If you thought this was cool, definitely like and subscribe. And I will definitely see you in another week. And one last question, sneaking it in there right before the end, Jared. Does anyone do a sleeve-like game board where you can have cheaper, thinner boards slide into and have more boards in one box? I've never seen it, but for paper maps like this, I had friends who had big sheets of clear acrylic, like table-size sheets of acrylic, and they would put their paper maps under them very carefully, lay them all out, and then flatten them with a big sheet of plexiglass or clear acrylic, and play on that. So that was almost kind of the same thing. I don't know if anyone else does that. Perhaps something to look into for next week. Until then, everyone enjoy your weekend. Thanks for tuning in. We will see you then.